So the book, The Boiling Moat Strategy, what about the idea that if the U.S. does try this deterrence strategy, puts more of its military focus in the Taiwan Strait, what if that actually causes an accidental war?
It's great. Chris, thanks for bringing that up. This is one of those ones that's not intuitive. I'm the first to admit, I worked for many years as a journalist. There are certain things I learned about causes of war after my journalistic years. When I was a Marine officer, and then someone who spent a lot of time just reading history. One of the really interesting insights that several historians arrived at, historians who study the causes of wars,
which we know there's fewer people studying history.
There are fewer people studying it, but I'll give you the names of a few who've written some pretty interesting works. One is Geoffrey Blaney, who is an Australian historian. I dedicated chapter 3 of the book to him. I was really fortunate that he took the time to read the chapter before I published it. But also two late historians. One is Michael Howard of both Oxford and Yale, military historian. Evan Luard, the late member of parliament. He was a labor and socialist member of parliament who also was a great scholar, who wrote a book about war in international society, where he studied the causes of wars over the course of several centuries. So the conclusion that I'm about to describe to you doesn't come from right-wing thinkers. It comes from historians from a variety of different backgrounds and probably a variety of political leanings as well. What they found is that they could not find a true example of an accidental war over the course of the last several centuries. So there's this myth that caught fire, over the course of the 20th century, particularly with respect to World War I. That there was this popularized idea that World War I was just a total unintended war, and that is utterly false, according to the historical record. Virtually every major player that got involved made a very deliberate decision to get involved in that war. Really starting with Germany. This was not just an avalanche and somehow this conflagration just kind of sucked people in at the outset of the war. There were a lot of countries that did not intend to be in the war who later got pulled into it, but the war began with very deliberate decisions, very deliberate calculations made by leaders. And as the then Chancellor of Germany said, we're going to roll the iron dice. And he did. Now, there were all kinds of accidental consequences of the war, including losing the war, which was not what Germany was betting on. There were all sorts of miscalculations about the course and direction of the war, who would ultimately get involved, how long it would take. I mean, it's incredible to read the record, World War I. Everyone who got involved thought that this thing was going to be over in a matter of weeks. The Germans thought 6 weeks. The UK, the Germans thought they'd be able to keep the UK out. The UK got in and said, look, we'll wrap this up in a couple of months. The Tsar was nervous, but his military advisors said, no, we're going to win this. And it might be a few months. And so, the next thing you know, 21 million people are dead and over the course of a 4-year catastrophe. So it's not
yada, 21 million people dead.
So exactly. So there are accidental consequences, but the decision to go to war is seldom and perhaps never accidental. And so this is important for the process of deterrence, because if we understand that lesson from history, as I believe Xi Jinping does, as I've read Chinese military writing and newspaper commentaries, I've been unable to find, maybe it's out there, but at least from putting several hours into this, I've been unable to find references to the idea of accidental war, like the sign that Beijing is actually nervous that an accidental war might kick off. Although we do see Chinese writing about Biden being very fearful of accidental war. So if President Biden were not so fearful of accidental war, and we know he's very fearful of it because he talks about it all the time. He has told Xi Jinping personally several times, going all the way back to when the two of them were vice presidents together during the Obama administration. Biden has said to Xi Jinping, my father used to tell me the only thing worse than an accidental than war is an accidental war, or a war that was unintended. But there is no such thing. As counterintuitive as that sounds, I refer you to those historians I mentioned. Read the Causes of War by Jeffrey Blaney, which is a real classic. I think it should be, anyone who's going to work in national security should be required to read that book, because it's pregnant with so much insight about the causes of war and the reasons why peace breaks out and prevails when it does. So if we know that wars are not truly accidental, we will be less shy and less retiring about supporting our red lines and actually maintaining a strong forward presence in places like the South China Sea and the Taiwan Strait and along the First Island chain, because doing so makes war less likely, not more likely. President Biden quite literally has it backwards.
All right. So, for example, like let's say we set a red line that, okay, if the Chinese Navy or Coast Guard or maritime militia ships cross a certain line, whether it's the median line or whatever in the Taiwan Strait, then the U.S. will open fire or something, right? And what you're saying is that China would never actually do it accidentally. It just couldn't happen, because what they're really doing is their plan is to go to war, and they're going to, but whatever happens, like if they want to trigger for that war, then they'll start to gradually cross that line and see what happens. And if they don't want to trigger a war, then they'll stay away from it.
So accidents do happen on the high seas and in the skies when you've got warships and warplanes flying close together. We saw that back in 2001 when a Chinese interceptor jet steered itself accidentally into the propeller of an American spy plane. That was a fatal mistake for that Chinese pilot. It was nearly fatal for the crew of that American plane. So it's not that accidents don't happen. It's not that miscalculations don't happen. It's not that fatal mistakes don't happen. It is that those mistakes do not lead to war unless one of those two actors already really wanted to take advantage of one of these sort of incidents as a pretext to launch a war. In other words, those kinds of incidents are not causes of war, although they are often serve as pretexts for war. But there's a very, very big difference between the two. That we didn't have a war break out. There wasn't really a serious possibility that we would have had a war as a result of even the NATO bombing China's embassy mistakenly in 1999, or the spy plane incident over the South China Sea that I just described in 2001. Those things were not going to lead to a war. But if Beijing had been planning to try to conquer Taiwan and was getting ready, it might use an incident like that as a pretext so that it could shift the blame for that conflict. But the decision would be a wholly separate one about actually engaging in war. So that's the distinction I'm trying to draw out.
So you mentioned that there are Chinese writings about Biden being afraid of accidental war. Are there ways that the CCP is kind of using that to their advantage?
I think it's a big psychological advantage that the CCP wields over us, because Xi Jinping has even started talking about it to Biden again. According to one of Biden's biographers, their first phone call after Biden's inauguration, Xi Jinping repeated Biden's line to him, where Xi Jinping said, I remember you telling me, a dozen years ago that your father told you the only thing worse than war is an unintended war. I think Xi Jinping said that with a forked tongue. It was not a statement of empathy or agreement. It was a statement designed to enhance Biden's anxiety about accidental war. And so I actually would argue that it encourages greater risk taking on the part of Beijing, because if they know that we are scared that any incident that might occur, if there's a little bumper boats that goes on in the South China Sea, if Xi Jinping knows the American president is fearful that that might actually lead to World War III, Xi Jinping is going to be more inclined to do risky actions in the South China Sea or in the Taiwan Strait, because even an accidental mishap is more likely to cause the United States to back off further than it is to stiffen the resolve of the United States. So it is a psychological advantage that Xi Jinping has over President Biden, and it is one that I would argue encourages greater risk taking and pushing of the envelope on the part of Xi Jinping.